So Charlie Cook is considered one of the nation's leading authorities on U.S. elections and American political trends. He founded the independent, nonpartisan Cook Political Report in 1984, which is now, in the words of the New York Times, a newsletter that both parties regard as authoritative. The late David Broder of the Washington Post called Charlie perhaps the best nonpartisan handicapper of congressional elections. And the Wall Street Journal once called him, get this, the Picasso of election analysts. The Picasso. That's amazing. For over a decade and a half, Charlie has written a weekly column for the National Journal Group. Over the years, Charlie has served as an election night analyst. Many of you have seen him, I'm sure, for CBS, CNN, NBC. Since 1996, he has appeared on NBC News Election Night Decision Desk in New York. In 2010, Charlie was the co-recipient of the American Political Science Association's prestigious Kerry McWilliams Award for outstanding contribution to our understanding of politics. And in 2013, he was a resident fellow at the Institute of Politics at the Harvard John F. Kennedy School of Government. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Charlie Cook.
Thanks, Paul. Thank you very much, Paul. When Al Hunt in the Wall Street Journal wrote the Picasso thing, my sister asked me, Picasso, isn't that the guy that painted a breast on a knee? And asked me if I was going through my blue period yet. But anyway, yeah, I didn't know what the hell it meant anyway. So anyway, thanks very much for having me. And I want to thank you all for what you do. That the way I look at things, you know, there are four, it's like a stool with four legs, and there are four essential elements. There's, you know, food, nutrition, there's educational opportunities, there's job opportunities, and there's housing, affordable housing. And you take the affordable housing out of the mix, and the other three don't work too well. So thank you very much for what you do. It's just really, really, really important. What was I going to say? You know, my goal is to talk today about the national political environment, what's going on right now, and to talk a little bit about the midterm election. But what I've found is that no matter how much I would like to forget how wrong I and everybody that does what I do for a living was in the last election, I would like to just forget about it. But people ask me, what in the hell happened and why were you guys all so wrong? So that's kind of the elephant in the room. So let me just talk about the elephant for 5 minutes, then we'll move on. The 2016 election was the most amazing thing I've ever seen. That you had the two most unpopular major party nominees in American history. And I'm going to say something really profound. Between these two, between Donald Trump over here and Hillary Clinton over here, one of them was going to win no matter what. And I mean, Jill Stein was never going to win, and Gary Johnson was never going to, one of them was going to win. And I'll tell you the truth, I thought that Donald Trump had very little of a chance, and in the last 3 weeks I thought that very little had gone to practically none. And this is what I think, I probably said 100 times during 2016, if this election is a referendum up or down on Donald Trump, he will lose. But if it's a referendum up or down on Hillary Clinton, she will lose. And through most of the campaign, the spotlight was on Donald Trump and on all the interesting things that he was saying and doing. And so it was a referendum up or down on Trump until the last 3 weeks. And I know Secretary Clinton and a lot of Democrats want to say, well, it was James Comey and the FBI and the emails and stuff. I kind of pull it back and do a little broader. I think what happened was 3 weeks or so before the election, You had the last debate, you had those Billy Bush Access Hollywood tapes come out where Trump was talking about women and his behavior around women. And I think from that point on, it looked like there was essentially no chance he was going to win. And so that spotlight shifted away from Donald Trump and exclusively on Hillary Clinton. And it kind of reminded a lot of people how ambivalent, how unenthusiastic they were about her. And that, you know, some people would rather have seen Bernie Sanders as the Democratic nominee. Other people would rather have seen Joe Biden. Other Democrats would rather have seen, you know, anybody else. And even a lot of people that thought that was really important for us to elect a woman president, she wasn't exactly the perfect vehicle for that because she had a lot of sort of sharp edges and corners, and there were a lot of reasons why a lot of people just flat didn't like her that I think had nothing to do about gender. But what happened was that there was so much ambivalence on the part of people on this side towards her, and this feeling that, okay, there's no danger that Donald Trump is going to get elected president anymore. And then over on the other side, you had one group of people that watched his television shows and really liked Donald Trump. There was a second group that just liked the idea of having a business person as president of the United States. And then there was a third group that just hated her. She called me deplorable. You had an intensity on his side and this incredible lack of enthusiasm on this side, so that I think most of the Trump's people probably assumed he wasn't going to win, but by God, they were going to vote no matter what, to send a message or whatever. And on her side, it was, she's going to win no matter what. So, you know, if I'm heading home from work and I have a choice of stopping to vote or picking up a gallon of milk or picking up your dry cleaning or, you know, dropping your kids off someplace or something, you know, well, she didn't need my vote anyway. Or maybe you're, you know, somebody said, well, I don't particularly like her and she's not going to win it. She's going to win anyway, so I'll throw my vote to Jill Stein, the Green Party candidate. Or, you know, I'd like to be able to smoke weed legally. I'll vote for Gary Johnson. You know, I mean, it was kind of, there are all kinds of reasons to either not vote or do something else on one side, and there was an incredible intensity on the other. And his people flat turned out, and a disproportionate share of her folks just flat didn't, which raises the question, well, why were the polls so wrong? You know, the national, my answer is, well, which polls are you talking about? Now, the national polls, if you looked at the Real Clear Politics average of all the national polls, they had Hillary Clinton winning by 3 points. And what do national polls measure? Well, what the national popular vote would be. Well, she won the national popular vote by 2.1 percentage points, 2.9 million votes. So 2-1 to 3, okay, they were off by 9/10 of a point. But, you know, hey, that's about as good as this stuff gets. I mean, in 2012, the national polls were a bit off. They thought the race between President Obama and Mitt Romney was going to be closer than it was, and Obama ended up winning by 3 points. But, you know, it got the direction right, and it was sort of the general degree right, but it didn't. But afterwards, when the national pollsters looked back and said, okay, why was it even off this much? And what they found, that there was a very small slice of people that were not polled, or that didn't answer the phone, that didn't go along with the interview. There was a little slice of people that didn't participate, and they tended to be overwhelmingly white. They tended to be male. They tend to have less than a college degree. And they tended to be in sort of the Rust Belt, the industrial states. And it wasn't a big slice, but in the states that made the difference in this election, you know, in Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, Rust Belt states, it was enough that tipped the election over. And people say, well, why did you miss Wisconsin and Pennsylvania and Michigan? Well, let me ask you this. In Wisconsin, there were 32 polls that came out between August and Election Day in Wisconsin. Hillary Clinton led in 32 out of 32. And then she lost Wisconsin by 0.7 of a point. In Pennsylvania, she was ahead in 37 out of 38. And Trump won by, again, 0.7 of a point. Then in Michigan, she was ahead in 25 out of 26, and Trump won Michigan by 0.2 of a point. And again, I think it was that his folks were mobilized and her people, you know, decided they had something better to do. And, you know, it just sort of happened. And I'll tell you, I've been watching politics closely since since I got out of high school in 1972 or more then, and I've never seen anything quite like it. Okay, so it is what it is. Now, in 230 days, we're going to have this midterm election, and between 90 and 100 million people will vote. And as in all of our national elections, all 435 members of the House, actually, I should stop. Tomorrow, about Paul's announcement, when you go up there, these members of Congress, they have to be here because the government shuts down on Friday if they don't pass a spending bill. So they're here and they're stuck. And a lot of people that would be coming in to meet with them probably are going to get, weathered out and get flights canceled. So Paul is absolutely right. They're a captive audience. They're going to be there. So, but remember one thing when you go up there. If you can guess, I have ADHD, so staying on task is a difficult thing for me. But is that tomorrow you're members of you're not Democrats, you're not Republicans, you're a member of the low income housing coalition. And that's your issue. So don't get into an argument about impeachment, and don't get into an argument about these other things. This is why you're here. You've got a really important issue, and the people that are going to be coming in and lobbying for, fighter airplanes or water conservation, I mean, they're not going to be lobbying on your issues. So you need, focus on what you're here for. But anyway, all 435 members of the House are up, and who's going to be in charge of the House for the last 2 years of President Trump's term of office? Is it going to be Republican majority led by Paul Ryan if he chooses to stick around? No, frankly, I don't think he is. I think he'd probably rather shoot him in the head rather than stay here any longer. But anyway, or will it be Nancy Pelosi and Democrats if she chooses to stick around and they choose to have her? You're going to have 30. Every national election you have a third of the Senate up. But in every national election, the Senate's not 51-49, just teetering right on the edge like this one. But also keep in mind that with Washington increasingly paralyzed and unable to do a whole lot, a lot of power is shifting out to the states, so that state capitals become more important. And that, we've got 3/4 of all the governorships are up in this midterm election cycle. 4/5 of all of the state legislative seats nationally are up in this election. We focus on presidential, but it's actually this midterm election cycle that in a lot of ways is just as important, or at least in terms of state politics, more important than even the presidential year. I think the general theme of this election year is think of a Democratic tidal wave and a Republican seawall. And which is going to be more powerful, stronger, the Democratic tidal wave or the Republican seawall? And I think that's what this is going to come down to. And talk about the House for a second. The House Republicans, as you all know, are in the majority. They have about 55% of all the seats, and Democrats have 45%. So Democrats need a 24-seat net gain to get a majority in the House. But here's an interesting little factoid. There are 23 Republicans that are sitting in districts that Hillary Clinton carried. So there is, well, I don't want to get into the prognostication, I'll do that in a minute, but the House it's a lot more vulnerable than 55% to 45% suggest. And as I said, in the Senate it's 51-49, it was 52-48 until Democrats picked up a seat now in December in Alabama. So if Democrats pick up just one seat, the Senate will be 50-50 and Vice President Pence will still break ties for Republicans. So Democrats need a net gain of 2 seats. And as I said, you've got 33, Republicans have 33 governors right now, Democrats have 16, but that Republicans have 26 governorships that are up. And keep in mind that governorships have, all but 2 states have 4-year terms. And so you look back at what happened 4 and 8 years ago, the last time this group of governorships were up. Well, it was President Obama's 2010 first-term midterm election and 2014 his second-term midterm election. Those were 2 horrible election years for Democrats. You know, 2008 when President Obama was elected, that was a good year for Democrats. 2012 when he got reelected was a good year for Democrats. But 2010, 2014 were awful, and Democrats lost a ton of governorships. So Republicans are coming into this one really, really, really overexposed, and they've got 12 governors that are retiring or can't run for reelection. Democrats only have 4. Republicans have a huge, huge, huge amount of exposure out there. So let's go back to the wave and the wall. How tall and strong is the wave, and how high and powerful is the Republican seawall? Well, let's talk about the wave first. One thing about midterm elections is they are generally referenda on the incumbent president. And it's really kind of spooky the way this works. Since the end of the Civil War, whichever party, Democrat or Republican, but whichever party was in the White House, they have lost seats in the House of Representatives in 35 out of 38 midterm elections, 92%. In the U.S. Senate, it's almost as strong. Since we started the direct election of U.S. senators in 1913, the party, whichever party was in the White House, lost Senate seats in 19 out of 26, 73%. 26 out of 29 midterm elections. In other words, 26 of the 29 midterm elections since 1902, the party in the White House lost governorships. And it's in state legislative seats, it's 27 out of the 29. So this is something that goes from top to bottom. Now, why does this happen? I think part of it is that about 40% fewer people vote in midterm elections than in the presidential year. And, you know, a lot of people, they'll vote in a presidential year because it's sort of their civic responsibility and president and all that, but don't feel that obligated to vote in midterm elections. But the people that do vote in midterm elections typically are people that are unhappy about something. Their noses are out of joint. They're angry about something. They want to send a message. And that's why these midterm elections tend to bite whoever's in the White House, bite them on the rear end. Now, back in the late 70s and 80s, the Democrats had a Speaker of the House, Tip O'Neill. He used to say, was famous for saying, all politics is local. Now, to me, what O'Neill meant by that was, you look at a state or you look at a district, and you look at who are the people that live there and the demographics and the voting history there. You look at the candidates and the campaigns and stuff, and you can generally figure out most of the time who's likely to win. But even when O'Neill said that, it was a bit of an exaggeration, because back even in those days, about all politics was local except when it wasn't. And about once a decade, you would have an election where all politics wasn't local. And there was like an invisible hand that was pushing the candidates of one party forward or the other party up. And you would see these really big dramatic things going on. And, you know, we saw it in 1958, 1966, and 1974, 1982, and 1990. You know, we would say about once a decade. But what's happened in more recent years is these midterm elections have gotten more, these wave elections have become bigger and more frequent. So that now, In the last 6 midterm elections, so starting in 1994, President Clinton's first term midterm election, in the last 6 midterm elections, either control of the House or control of the Senate or both has flipped in 4 out of 6. That's a lot. For something that only used to happen once a decade, that's a lot. And in 1994, under Clinton, Democrats lost the House of Representatives that they had controlled for 40 straight years. They had won 20 consecutive elections, and they lost the House and lost the Senate. 2006, President George W. Bush's second-term midterm election. The war in Iraq was hugely unpopular. President Bush's approval rating had dropped down in the Gallup poll to 38% going into Election Day, and Republicans lost their majorities in both the House and the Senate. 2010, Obama's first midterm election. Democrats lost their majority in the House. 2014, his second midterm election, Democrats lost the majority in the Senate. Now, in the 2 exceptions during this last 6 midterm elections, the 2 exceptions were, I thought, pretty exceptional circumstances. 1998, there was a backlash against impeachment, and so Clinton's party actually, Democrats picked up a little bit in the House and Senate. The other one was 2002. The election was just 14 months after 9/11. It was before the war in Iraq became unpopular. And President Bush's approval ratings were still really high in 2002. As I said, 14 months after 9/11, and Republicans actually picked up a few seats. But, these were pretty exceptional circumstances. And the thing that drove what happened was presidential approval. And if you think about the last 8 midterm elections, in 4 of them, the party in the White House had a the president had a job approval rating of over 50%. And if you look at the average of those 4, not much happened in those midterm elections. But in 4 of them, the president had a job approval rating below 50%, actually 46% or lower. And in those 4, the party in the White House lost an average of 7 U.S. Senate seats, which is huge, and 40 seats in the House of Representatives. So how the president's approval rating was a really, really big deal. So the question now is, okay, is 2018, is this going to be part of the rule with the president's party generally getting hammered and look at presidential approval, or is there some reason why this might be the exception to the rule? Now, polling, if you look at the average of all presidents since the end of World War II in the Gallup poll, the average presidential job approval rate is 53%. And if you look at this point, early in their second year, the average job approval rate is about 64%. And then they start getting increasingly less popular as that second year goes along. So where's President Trump right now? In the Gallup poll that was through for last week, that was through Sunday night, the president's approval rating was 40%. His disapproval rating was 56%. Now that is the lowest approval rating for an elected president at this point in the presidency, the lowest we've ever had. And you say, okay, well, what's underneath that 40 approved and 56 disapproved? Well, the 40 approved, last week, 82% of all Republicans approved the job Donald Trump was doing as president. 82%. But among independents, it was only 32%. And among Democrats, it was just 7%. Now, I'm not sure who those 7% were. I'll tell you, I know it's not my wife. But now, there's a natural human tendency that people have, is to look for the poll that tells you what you'd like to see happen and ignore any poll that tells you what you'd rather see not happen. It's kind of called cherry picking. And so if you're a Republican, if you're a conservative or you're a Republican, you want to look at the Rasmussen poll, because it's like the only poll that has good numbers for President Trump. Now, put aside the fact that the Rasmussen is one of these robo-polls and it can't call cell phones, and over half of people primarily use cell phones, but putting that aside, they still aren't any good, you know? And you know, I'm just, anyway. But there are certain polls particularly several university polls that Democrats and liberals love. And I suggest to people, you know, if you're into this stuff, look at the averages. And you can go on, you know, realclearpolitics.com, which is like a little right-of-center website. And they do an average of all the major national polls. And Nate Silver has something called 538.com, and they do an average, and they generally are pretty consistent. In fact, they both have the average of all of President Trump's approval ratings right now are 41% approve and 54% disapprove. Now, my favorite poll, the NBC Wall Street Journal poll, has the approval at 43 with the disapproval 53, which is still pretty lousy. Now, President Trump's approval ratings did tick up a little bit in early January after the tax cut passed. And I think part of what happened was, you know, a lot of Republicans, a lot of conservatives were feeling kind of down over last year. That all the things that they wanted to see happen, all the things that President Trump and Republicans had promised, they hadn't been able to deliver on anything. You know, their 4 top priorities: repeal and replace Obamacare, where that didn't work out well; building a border wall, where that hadn't happened yet; and some of them wanted a big infrastructure package; and then the 4th thing was a big tax cut. Well, 3 of them didn't happen at all last year, and the 4th one didn't happen until, you know, the last 2 weeks of the year. You know, like the last 3 minutes of the ball game, it didn't happen. So they were kind of despondent through most of the year. But when the tax cut passed, then they started feeling got a little starch in their shorts and started feeling a little better. And the president's numbers went up among Republicans. They went up briefly among independents, and they kind of rolled back down, went back to where they were before. And up until last week, they actually had been higher than they were last fall for Republicans. You know, he had been in the sort of 77 to 83% range among Republicans, and then he jumped up to the 85 to 90% among Republicans. But last week they kind of dipped back down to 82%. But what really scares Republicans is the intensity of the opposition to President Trump. And remember, it was intensity that effectively elected him, that his people had a greater intensity of support than her people were. But when you look at the polls, now some of the pollsters only ask you approve, disapprove. But other pollsters will ask, if you say you approve, they would say, well, do you strongly approve or only somewhat approve? Or if you said you disapprove, do you strongly disapprove or somewhat disapprove? And one of the things we look at is, okay, how many people strongly approve and how many people strongly disapprove? These are the people that feel really passionate about things and tend to vote more. So in the last CNN poll that did the intensity, 27% strongly approved the job President Trump was doing, but 48% strongly disapproved. In the NBC Wall Street Journal poll, it was 25 strong approve, 43 strong disapprove. In the ABC Post poll, 24% strong approve, 49 strong disapprove. And even in the Fox News poll, 30% strongly approve, 45% strongly disapprove. In other words, for every 2 people that strongly approve, there were 3 people that strongly disapprove. That worries Republicans, given that fewer people vote in these midterm elections, and those are the kind of people that typically vote. Now, one of the sort of diagnostic indicators that we watch to see what kind of election might this be is something called the generic congressional ballot test. And it's a poll question where you can ask it one of 2 ways. You either ask, if the election were held today, would you vote for the Democratic candidate for Congress or the Republican candidate? And you don't give the names out. Or the other way is, which party would you rather see in control, Democrats or Republicans? And right now, in the averages, Democrats are averaging, on the Real Clear Politics, an 8-point lead. In the 538, it's a 10-point lead. In the NBC Wall Street Journal poll, it's a 10-point lead, 52-40. Now, if it's a 10-point lead for Democrats, they're winning a majority in the House. I mean, that just is what it is. But these poll numbers, I'm looking around, I'm 64, and there are really not many people in this room that are old enough to remember this reference, so I probably shouldn't use it. But back when I was a kid, there was a TV show called Lost in Space. You remember it. And remember, there was a robot that would say, danger, 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 Will Robinson, danger, danger. Well, there's sort of poll questions you look at and sort of flash danger. And for Republicans, these polls are flashing danger. So you look at poll, we know what the historic pattern is. Then we look at the polls, national, state, and down on the district level. The polls are flashing danger, danger, danger for Republicans. And then you look at election results. What's happened? What have voters done since the November 2016 election? And last week, as everyone here knows, you had a Democrat up and win in a district that President Trump carried by almost 20 points, that Romney carried by 17 points, and they're busy trashing their candidate. And yes, the Republican candidate was a really mediocre candidate. But if you're in a district where your side usually wins by 17 to 20 points, you could have, and I'm going to use a technical political science term here, a really crappy candidate. And you're still going to win just by not as big a margin as you should. This was now, was the Democratic candidate like unusually good? Yes. And the Republican candidate was really, but this is still flashing sort of danger, danger, danger. Second thing we look at is, and in other congressional special elections that happened last year, that Democrats didn't gain any from Republicans, but the Republican candidate underperformed what you would expect that Republican to do in that district, or the Democrat overperformed by 6, 7, 8 points typically. So that pattern was there. It's just that they were in, South Carolina and Montana and Kansas and, some places that really weren't terribly friendly territory for Democrats. So, but the Democrats still overperformed. Then you look at state legislative elections. And since November of 2016, there have been 39 state legislative districts around the country that had elections where a Republican seat went Democratic, 39. And there are only 4 where you had a Democratic seat that went Republican. And you could explain away individually each of these things, but when you see that kind of pattern, it's usually sort of a danger, danger, danger thing. Now, the third one, in statewide elections, if I worked for the Democratic National Committee, I would stand up here and I would say, there were 5 statewide elections since November of 2016, and Republicans went 0 for 5. Now, lightning would not strike me down because technically it's true. Now, to be honest, I think a couple of them really weren't about President Trump or really weren't about congressional Republicans. Now, let me ask, who's here from Alabama? Anybody? Oh, a couple people. Now, I'll ask you after I finish whether you disagree or not, but I don't think Alabama was really about Donald Trump or congressional Republicans. It was about Roy Moore. And if you think about it, I figure there have been roughly 10, he was had been a Chief Justice of the state Supreme Court. I figure there have been about 10,000 people in American history that have been state Supreme Court justices in one of the 50 states. 10,000, let's say. Now you ask yourself, how many of those 10,000 or so have ever been removed from office? How many have been removed from office twice? How many Chief Justices have been removed? I think we're looking at a sample of 1 in American history. This man was toxic before we even knew about his interest in high school girls. Now, a word about that. It's clear to me that in his 30s, Roy Moore dated more high school girls than I did when I was in high school. And if I sound resentful, so be it. But this guy, I mean, the thing is, if Republicans had just nominated the guy that had been, the Republican had been appointed to the seat, and I don't want to take anything away from Doug Jones, the Democratic candidate. He had a remarkable history. He was a good candidate, raised a good, had a good campaign and raised a lot of money, and he did everything right. But let's face it, in a statewide election in Alabama, a Democrat can do everything right, they're still going to lose. Hell, they'll still lose badly. But the thing is, if Republicans had nominated the other guy, if Republicans had put a dartboard up and put the faces of every Republican in the Alabama House delegation and just over their shoulder threw a dart, and they just ran whichever one of those, they would have held on to the seat. So this was kind of about Roy Moore, okay? Now, how many of you are from New Jersey? Oh, wait, any of you Alabama folks strongly disagree? No, not really? Okay, now who's from New Jersey? Okay, a few more, not that many here. Now, New Jersey's more of it's pretty much a Democratic state, and every once in a while Republicans will elect a governor, Tom Kaine, Christie Whitman, and they did elect Chris Christie, but it's really pretty much of a Democratic state. Now, once you got past the bridge thing, I think there were probably social diseases in New Jersey that had higher favorable ratings than Chris Christie had. So his lieutenant governor, she wasn't going to win. I mean, and that doesn't have anything to do with Trump or the Republican Party. It was just that Chris Christie had so messed it up that a Republican wasn't going to win. So I don't count those two against him. But the other three, I think, are legit. You know, the Virginia governor's race, the lieutenant governor's race in Virginia, and the attorney general's race in Virginia. You know, in the governor's race, the Republican candidate, a guy named Ed Gillespie, a smart guy, and he didn't make any big mistakes or anything. He not just lost, he lost by 9 percentage points. But here's the catch. In small town, rural Virginia, in the southern part of the state, the southwestern, and he's from the Washington suburbs, but in those kinds of places, he ran ahead of where winning Republicans normally do. But what happened was he just got buried in the suburbs. I mean, just killed, and particularly college-educated suburban women. It was like really, really, really ugly. And, okay, 15 minutes remaining. I got to hurry and speed up. So, it was really, really, really ugly, and that was a tip-off, again, the danger, Will Robinson, danger of in the suburbs, and particularly with women voters in the suburbs, and I should add younger voters, that Republicans just have all kinds of problems, and a lot of that does have to do with President Trump. Now, I've talked about the wave, and I've been doing this a long time, and the only thing that's different from this wave, or the main thing that's different from big wave elections we've seen in 1994 and 2006 and 2010, 2014, is this one's starting earlier. I mean, that's the big difference, but it's pretty big. So let's talk about the wall for a second. There are some things that protect Republicans to a certain extent, and one is redistricting. Now, for all the way back to the earliest years of our country, there's been something called gerrymandering, where whoever's in charge in the state, and in all but 3 states, the state legislature basically draws the maps. In some states, the governors have something to do with it, and some they don't. But basically, they generally draw maps that help their party. And for generations, Democrats had the majority of the governorships, the majority of the state legislative chambers around the country, and they drew maps that, shocking, benefited Democrats. Well, every 10 years they redraw the maps, as you know, after the census. Well, 2010 was a horrific year for Democrats. So in 2011, suddenly Republicans had a majority of the governorships around the country, a majority of the state legislative chambers around the country. So Republicans were able to do to Democrats what Democrats had done to Republicans for so many years. And Republicans, shocking, drew maps that benefited Republicans in this Congress and in the House of Representatives and state legislature. So that helps Republicans to a certain extent. But there's one other thing, and it's population, what we call population sorting. And if you now keep in mind that once you win a district by 1 vote, every vote you get in that district above that point is wasted. You don't get brownie points or extra seats for winning big. And so ask yourself this question: where do Democratic voters typically live? They live in urban areas and college, cities and college towns. And where do Republican voters typically live? Everywhere else. And so Republican voters are very efficiently allocated and Democratic voters are highly concentrated. So Democratic voters run up the score in cities, wasting a lot of votes, and Republicans win more seats by fewer. Now, so these two factors create a wall that partially protect Republicans. But I think what this means is a wave that might normally cost them 40 or 50 or 60 seats might only cost Republicans 20 or 25 or 30 or 35 seats. It protects them, but I think in the House, to be perfectly honest, the wave is a lot bigger than the wall. And that's why right now there's at least a 60-65% chance that Republicans lose their majority in the House of Representatives. Now, could things change between now and November 6th? Absolutely, but change is the operative word. They're on a trajectory to lose the House unless things change. Some intervening event changes the trajectory of this thing. Now, in the Senate, you'd think that with the Senate being just 51-49, that Democrats would have a better chance of winning a majority in the Senate than in the House, it's 55-45. But in the Senate, it matters what's up, who's up, because remember only roughly a third are up each time. And this is where Democrats, because the Senate has 6-year terms, if you look back 6 years ago, 12 years ago, Democrats had fabulous years in 2006. Bush's second-term midterm election, when his numbers were so low, Democrats had picked up 6 U.S. Senate seats in that election. And then 6 years after that, President Obama was getting reelected by a 3-point margin, a little bigger than we expected, and he had that fabulous campaign organization. And so Democrats picked up 2 more seats on top of the 6 that they had picked up 6 years earlier. So Democrats go into this election really overexposed. Democrats have 26 seats up at risk, and Republicans only have 9. But it's actually kind of worse for Democrats than that, because of the 26 Democratic seats that are up, 10 of them are in states that President Trump carried in the last election. And there's only 1 Republican up in a state that Hillary Clinton carried, Dean Heller in Nevada. Now, of the 10 Democratic incumbents that are up in states that Trump carried, 5 of them are in states that Donald Trump carried by 19 points or more. So if you're a Democrat like Heidi Heitkamp in North Dakota, and you're running for re-election in a state that Romney carried by 20 and Trump carried by 36 points, or Joe Manchin in West Virginia, a state that Romney carried by 27, Trump by 42. Joe Donnelly in Indiana, a state that Romney won by 10, Trump by 19. Claire McCaskill in Missouri, Romney won by 9, Trump by 19. John Tester in Montana, Romney won by 14, Trump won by 21. And I am not predicting that all 5 of these are going to lose, but they're sort of parachuting behind enemy lines. I mean, these are difficult places. And there's only 1 Republican up in a truly difficult state. Plus, I left out one where a Democrat is up in a state that Trump just barely carried, Bill Nelson in Florida, but the governor is almost certainly going to run, so that's going to be. So you have a really challenging situation for Democrats, where they've got this big wave, but where that wall is really, really high. Now, Republicans have a few seats they have to worry about. In addition to Nevada, they've got 1 in Arizona, and they've got 1 in Tennessee, where Democrats have an unusually good chance to win there. So there are some places, Democrats have some opportunities. I frankly think that the Senate, it's probably a 60-65% chance that Republicans hold on to their majority of the Senate. But the thing is, there's a chance, this wave's pretty damn big. And so could Democrats get a majority of the Senate? Sure they could. Okay, I'm going to skip over a couple things. Now, what's this election going to turn on? It's number 1, what does the economy do between now and the election? And number 2, is if the economy does continue to grow, and admittedly, it's not growing for everyone. I will give you that. But we are looking at consumer confidence is at some of the highest levels we've ever seen. And so it's working for a lot of people, just not for everyone. But does the economy continue to grow? But here's the other thing. If it does President Trump, and by extension congressional Republicans, do they get credit for continuing growth Or is the visceral dislike for President Trump so high among some people that it doesn't matter what the economy does? They're ticked off. And that's a real key question here. So this midterm election, it's huge. Now, obviously, President Trump, we're dealing with a extraordinarily unusual person. And if you think about it, but think about our 44 previous presidents of the United States. 19 of them had served in the House of Representatives at some point in their careers. 17 as governors, 16 as senators, 14 vice presidents, 13 state legislators, 12 had been Army generals, 8 cabinet members, 8 ambassadors. This is the first president in American history, unless you want to get really, who has never worked in government, federal, state, local, civilian, military, elected, appointed, no role whatsoever. And that has it's said that no one is ever truly prepared to be president, but some people are more prepared than others. And so President Trump has had some unique challenges. And one is a steep learning curve in terms of process. How does government work? How does the legislative process work? How does the budget process? How does the national security process? Let me just give you one example. Out on the campaign trail and as president-elect, Donald Trump would say, we're going to repeal and replace Obamacare. It will be quick. It'll be easy. Well, the thing is, I kind of doubt if he ever asked Speaker Paul Ryan, now, repeal and replace Obamacare, that's quick and easy, right? I kind of don't think Ryan ever told him that it'd be quick or easy. And I don't think Mitch McConnell, the majority leader, ever told him it'd be quick and easy. I think you could have given him a shot of sodium pentothal, truth serum, and wired him up to a polygraph machine, and he would have said, quick, easy, and he would have passed that he thought it really would be quick and easy. Well, first of all, nothing in Congress ever happens quick and easy. And the House is supposed to be responsive to the people, but it works slow. And then in the Senate, it's supposed to be slow and deliberative, and boy, is it good at that. And you have a 51-49 majority. What's the joke in the Caribbean? That there are 3 speeds: slow, real slow, and dead stop. And that's kind of like the Senate, where people in the House joke that the Senate is where legislation goes to die. Well, the thing about it is when you have a president that doesn't really understand the process, that's a problem. Second is policy, is that President Trump is not someone who would spend a lot of time going to conferences at think tanks like the Brookings Institute or the American Enterprise Institute or Heritage or whatever. This is not someone who would read The Economist magazine every week, that would read the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal and the Washington Post from front to back every day. This is somebody whose primary source of information before becoming president was really watching television, watching cable television. And that provides a rather limited view of policy. So steep learning curve in terms of policy. The third thing is a challenge in terms of temperament. That ever since his father passed away in 1999, Donald Trump has been, first of all, he took over the family business, and yeah, it's a $3.7 billion family business, but fundamentally it's a family business. And he never had a board he had to answer to, or a management committee or anything like that. He just sort of did what he wanted to do, and the way he wanted to do it, and who was going to scold him? Who was going to keep him, So suddenly, as President of the United States, this is a temperament thing that he's had a really hard adjustment. And then the fourth thing is public acceptance. Now, Donald Trump is the 5th president we've had that didn't win the popular vote. And it's happened 4 times before, most recently in 2000 when George W. Bush was elected over Al Gore. And, Gore won the popular vote, but by a half a percentage point, a little over 500,000 votes. But George W. Bush won the Electoral College. It can happen. We knew it could happen, but we didn't think, I'm sounding defensive again, we didn't think you could lose the popular vote by 2.1 percentage points, by 2.9 million votes, and still win the Electoral College. You knew it was statistically possible, but it had been 140 years since 1876 when you've had that big of a gap between how the popular vote went and how the Electoral College went. And as a result, there was a lack of sort of broad public acceptance that normally, when you're a new president, there are people that usually that voted against you, but hey, I'm an American. I want the country to do well, and maybe I didn't vote for this person, but you know, you want the country to do okay. And the thing is, you think about George W. Bush. You don't take the presidency under much worse circumstances than George W. Bush had, where not only did the other guy win more votes, but the one state that made the difference, Florida, was contested. The thing that went all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court. But the thing is, at the end of his first week in office, the Gallup poll was taken at the end of his first week in office, 57% of Americans approved the job Bush was doing. Obviously, a lot of people who didn't vote for him were willing to give him the benefit of the doubt, willing to give him kind of a honeymoon. For Obama, his first approval rating one weekend was 68%. For Bill Clinton, it was 58%. But for Donald Trump, it was 45%. 1 point less than the share of the vote he got. It was 45 approved, 45 disapproved. So there was like no honeymoon there, no benefit of the doubt. So that coming in, not only did he have a steep learning curve in terms of learning the process and a steep learning curve in terms of policy and sort of a unusual temperament, but he didn't have a public that was standing behind him and willing to give him the benefit of the doubt. So when very little happened in the first 50 weeks of last year legislatively, you know, you can kind of understand. I'm not trying to make excuses for the guy, but it just, you know, there's a reason for that. Now, let me close on this. But that election made a huge difference because elections matter. And if you look, nothing else other than three things. Regulations, that when you have President Trump and his appointees making regulatory decisions, they're going to be really, really, really different than President Obama and Obama appointees. So that regulatory and enforcement, and it doesn't matter whether it's EPA or OSHA or any other kind of standards, there's like a new sheriff in town, and this sheriff is a lot more, has a different attitude than the previous sheriff. That's a big deal. And the final thing is the judiciary, is the judges, the court system. Now, when the Supreme Court, before Justice Scalia died, there were 4 liberals, there were 4 conservatives, and 1 swing vote, okay? And then Scalia died, so you had 4 liberals, 3 conservatives, 1 swing, 1 vacant seat, okay? Now, but when President Trump and Senate Republicans were able to push through Neil Gorsuch, it goes back to 4-4-1. So you say, well, it just went back to where it was before Scalia, except for one thing, that Neil Gorsuch is 50 years old, 50. Now, these are lifetime appointments, so that if Neil Gorsuch is on the court when he's the same age as Ruth Bader Ginsburg, he will be on the court in the year 2051. She's like 84. Actually, I think she just turned 85. But anyway, that makes, and so even if there are no other vacancies on the court while Trump's in office, that is a fairly big, you can like it or hate it, but it's a big deal. But if there is a vacancy underneath Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who's liberal, you've got Anthony Kennedy, the swing vote, who's 81 years old. Then you've got Stephen Breyer, who's a liberal, who's 79. He's the 3rd oldest. You have to go 10 years younger than that to Clarence Thomas, who's 69, before you get to the oldest conservative. So if there is another vacancy on the court, it's a little bit more likely to be a swing or a liberal than it is conservative. Well, it could be any one of them. But so this election had a huge difference, the 2016 election, even if Republicans weren't able to get a whole lot through Congress. But so, wow. Anyway, I've talked way too long. Do we have time for any questions, comments, accusations? One question. Your hand went up. Thank you. I apologize for talking too long.
Thank you. Oh, you're going to hold it for me. Yeah, I just wrote it down just to stay on focus. So just two things that really weren't mentioned that I think are pretty important with the political landscape.
There was a lot that wasn't mentioned.
So specifically, Russia and racism. I think that the entire intelligence community has identified that Russian interference had an impact on the 2016 election, and we obviously had a president who hasn't identified this as an issue. So earlier you talked about polls and their reliability. The polls can't count for cheating. So I just wanted to say that. And then on the racism point, you talked about economic anxiety. And I feel like this is a myth that just people keep saying. And as an intelligent guy that writes and people care about what you think, I just want to encourage you to be really open in saying that, as we're here at the National Low-Income Housing Conference, that racism had an impact since Obama was president until the day the economy has continuously just gotten better. So the economic anxiety thing, it doesn't really seem to realistically be a problem, although racism and certain forms of people feeling as though their identity has been challenged is.
Yeah, good point. Part of it is, just an explanation. I sometimes have to worry about looking like I'm piling on. And so I generally sort of don't bring up Russia because I know it's going to be either the first or the second question, and then I get a chance to do it, but I think that baked into the cake of the intensity was a lot of what the Russians did, because I think they were clearly doing things to influence the election. Now, whether there was collusion or not, and whether, the Trump campaign manager had a conference call with the GRU, Russian military intelligence, but the thing is, clearly they were doing, I think that, number one, intelligence agencies, one of the things they do is they spy, but they also do forms of sabotage, of trying to screw with their enemy countries. And I think there was a trying to undercut our democratic process, our system, our esteem around the world. I mean, I think they were trying to subvert our process. But the second thing is that Putin hated Hillary Clinton because she had tried to do things to encourage the democratic movement in Russia that he did not appreciate. And so I don't think he really thought he could beat her. But I think he wanted to just, make life as difficult as he possibly could. And they did a really, really good job. And so they effectively undercut, whether it was the prying into her emails and getting them released through WikiLeaks and all. I mean, I think there was massive interference that weakened her and at the same time was pumping Donald Trump up. And that I think it worked better than their wildest expectations, but I think it did have a factor. Now, I mean, Hillary Clinton is a very smart, capable person, but she's hard to love. And so she was not a pure vehicle, but no, I don't think there's no question there was German interference. Now, whether there's collusion or not, I don't know. But I do know that special counsel, special prosecutors, okay. What? Yeah. I get the hook. Okay. This is the legal equivalent of a full cavity search. They can look at anything they want to look at. And Whitewater started off as a failed Arkansas land deal and ended up with like blue dresses and stuff. These things go anywhere they want to go, and whether it's collusion or not, this is going to be something that's going to be hurting Republicans every single day. And this is something that, so it did have an impact on the election. And when you have two states one by 0.7 of a point, one state by 0.2 of a point, little bitty things matter. And it did matter. in the big scheme of things. Finally, thank you for everything you do. Thank you for having me here. And I hope that you have lots of members of Congress tomorrow who are captive audiences, and that you can try to educate them on the need and what we need to do in terms of providing for affordable housing. Thank you all so much.
Thank you, Charlie. Thank you so much.